Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, this is one that was suggested over on the Discord server, and I thought it looked really, really interesting, and it kind of molds more modern history and politics, but also what we typically do on this channel, which is to take a look at past events and analyze them and maybe even apply them to the present day. So this is from a channel called Election History, which has 23,000 subscribers. And the video is 17 political quotes that destroyed campaigns. In other words, I guess they're looking at moments where a line, a phrase, an event of some kind is looked back on in history as the moment that person's campaign, either at that moment or in the future, came undone. So we'll watch these. We'll talk about what happened in the aftermath, whether I agree with them or not. Let me know which ones you think should have been added that weren't added to this list. I don't know what's on the list. I guess we're going to find out. It's a longer video. It's 37 minutes long, so we may cut some of it out and just look at some of the highlights just so this reaction's not like an hour and a half long or anything like that. And I want to say a thank you to Jim Triggs for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much. Let's dive into this one.
Of course, some quotes don't always destroy political careers, but show that a political career has already run its course. The first person we are going to look at is Jeb Bush. During the 2016 Republican nomination for president, Jeb was one of the early frontrunners. But as the campaign moved on, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio moved ahead of Bush, pushing him further down the list.
So the 2016 election obviously is one we're going to look back on in history for a long, long time, because it really fundamentally transformed the landscape of politics in this country, right? I mean, we're going to come up to 2028, and it'll be the first time in 16 years that Donald Trump's not on the ballot. And it's going to be interesting to see how we're at, where we are at that time. But the interesting thing about that election is you had so many Republicans running for that nomination. It was such a wide open race because you had George W. Bush president for 8 years, and then in 2008 you had John McCain run, and of course he lost to Obama. 2012, Mitt Romney loses to Obama, and so it kind of reset the Republican field. So it was wide open at that point. You had no real successor. And Jeb Bush was a natural frontrunner. He's the son of a president. He's the brother of a president, and it just kind of made sense. And in any other year where there were maybe 3 or 4 main candidates, he might have had a really good chance. But this was a unique year where you got nearly 20 people running for the nomination, and it just really diluted the vote, and a lot of people split up among all those candidates, and it gave Trump an opening.
After finishing a disappointing 6th in the Iowa caucuses, with Ben Carson and Rand Paul finishing ahead of Bush, the first primary was in New Hampshire. It was at this point that the only people still with Bush were his diehard supporters. But it was easy to tell that Jeb was done, and enthusiasm in his campaign had dwindled to nothing. On February 2nd, 2016, in Hanover, New Hampshire, he said that the next president of the United States should be quieter and focus on acting in the nation's security's interest instead of acting like a blowhard. He expected a good reaction, but instead...
Please clap.
I will say this. I think a couple of things about this. I think taken out of context, which I'm sure a lot of these will be, and that's what we do, right? We take things out of context because on their own, they seem really awkward and really strange. In the context of this, I think this is blown way out of proportion. You know, with what he said before that, the way he said, please clap. It wasn't like, I know this is spun as being like, oh, look how sad this is that he has to ask people to clap. But in the context of it, it was really more of a, come on, guys, you have to acknowledge that. You know, I mean, I don't think it was an indication of a dying campaign. I think the campaign was already dead at that point, and I don't think that this line made any difference whatsoever in the outcome of the campaign for him. But it did get spun as something that we remember it as today.
Yeah, that showed how desperate Bush actually was.
See, I don't think that's what that was at all. I know that's how we see it, but I don't think that's what was happening here.
He finished a distant fourth in New Hampshire and dropped out of the race on February 20th. Since then, he's been absolutely absent from the political scene, and if you want to watch a detailed video about Jeb's first run for public office, you can check out this video here.
Right, yeah, I mean, where do you go from there anyway, right? You've been governor of Florida, and now you're running for president, and that fails. I mean, you either run for president again, or you just kind of fade off into retirement at that point.
Yes, I know that I'm starting to sound like Elizabeth Warren saying that I have a video for that, but a lot of times I do. Let's stay with the Bush family and move to Jeb's father, George. At the 1988 Republican convention, many within conservative Republican circles thought that Vice President George Bush, now the nominee for the Republicans, might raise taxes. During his 1980 campaign for the Republican nomination, Bush criticized Reagan's economic policy.
Yeah, so you have to remember that in the 70s, which is the era in which we're coming out of when we get into Bush and Reagan running against each other for the 1980 nomination, you still have a liberal wing to the Republican Party, a conservative wing to the Republican Party, moderates within the Republican Party. Reagan was a much more conservative Republican than George H.W. Bush was. And at this point, Bush, he had, I think, served briefly in Congress. He was a CIA director. He was the chairman of the Republican Party. And Reagan comes along. He's the former governor of California. He's much more conservative, and he pushes the Republican Party in that direction. And so it was natural for people to believe that Bush was going to pull them back from being pushed further to the right, back more toward the center of where the Republican Party had been. So it was natural that that would happen, and it was natural for Bush to address that when he was running.
Years later, here he was needing to reassure conservatives that he was on board. At the convention, Bush famously said,
"But I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them,
read my lips.
Read my lips. No new taxes."
Of course, this didn't hurt him in the 1988 presidential election, which I talk about more in detail here, but in the 1992 presidential election, which I talk about in detail in this video, it did hurt him, as he did raise taxes during his term as president. And I know there will probably be some Republicans in the comments saying that Bush was forced to raise taxes because of the Democrats in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. It doesn't make it, but that was the context in which he said it, right? He said, the Congress, you got to remember that Congress had been Democrat for decades at this point. The Republicans had not controlled Congress, I think, going back to the 40s and 50s was the last time the Republicans had the Speaker of the House. It had been solid Democrat leadership for going on 40 years when Newt Gingrich finally becomes Speaker in 94, when you have the Republicans take over the House for the first time. So that's after Bush is president. So Bush and Reagan both had Democrat House for the entire time they were in office. But that's what he said. He said, they're going to push me and I'm going to say no. Well, they pushed him and he didn't say no. But Bush still would have won that 92 election if you didn't have Ross Perot. Ross Perot ran, and it's a fascinating race, and I think pulled, he gets something close to 20% of the vote. And Bill Clinton wins with what, like 40, 42%, something like that. So it was definitely a very unique election in that way. I don't know that that would have been fatal to Bush otherwise.
Well, no, he could have just always vetoed the budget. Anyway, the Clinton campaign pounced on it, and his read my lips promise ended up getting Bush 4 years later. Of course, saying that you're going to cut taxes is one of the biggest promises that candidates running for office make, even if they have no intention whatsoever of doing so. But what if a candidate actually tells you that they want to raise taxes? Well, that's exactly what Walter Mondale did 4 years before George Bush's promises of no new taxes. At the Democratic National Convention in 1984, former Vice President Walter Mondale wanted people to trust his candidacy in what would eventually become an uphill battle to win. To show his honesty, Mondale said,
"Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you,
I just did.
I just did.
Yes, promising to raise taxes isn't exactly the best campaign strategy, and Mondale would go on to lose 49 states in that presidential election.
And he barely won his home state of Minnesota by a couple of thousand votes. Honestly, I think in this election, the more memorable quote, that's a good one. I mean, that's definitely a good one to highlight. The more memorable quote for me in that election is during the debate when they make a reference to Ronald Reagan's age. He was at that point running to become the oldest person ever elected president of the United States. He's running for re-election. And Reagan very famously says, I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I will not, for political purposes, exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience. At this point, it was just making light of it, but it completely removed that topic from the table as far as an issue. It became a non-issue after that. But, I mean, Mondale was never going to win that election. I don't think it much mattered what he said.
But Mondale wasn't the only Democratic presidential candidate who was a little bit too truthful when it came to their public statements. So was Kamala Harris. After vice president, wow, there seems to be a lot of vice presidents on this list. After Vice President Harris was selected as the Democratic nominee because, let's be honest, all of the delegates were Biden delegates and simply rubber-stamped Harris as the nominee once Biden dropped out of the race. While Biden's horrible debate performance was a contributing factor for him dropping out, so was the fact that inflation was high and people were feeling the squeeze on everything that they bought.
And see, that's the thing that I think people need to realize is that I'm not sure it mattered who the Democrat was. Rightly or wrongly, people blame the party in power when they don't perceive that the economy's doing well or the nation's doing well. And like I said, I'm not saying it was Biden's fault. I'm just saying he was president. The Democrats were in control. And so the Democrats get blamed for it. And so it didn't matter if it was Biden, didn't matter if it was Harris. I think they were going to lose regardless.
Still, the Democrats were oblivious to the plight of the average American. And while Harris and her vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz, both acknowledged the economic problems that hit Americans, they had no solutions. People didn't want to continue Biden's policy. However, when she appeared on The View on October 8, 2024, she was asked the following.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden?
And remember the context, right? People are viewing the country as not in a great place. And now you're asking the person who is part of the administration who's in power, would you do something different? So and this is a tough spot for the vice president. Does she publicly distance herself from the sitting president? I think you probably have to in that situation. Or does she kind of toed the line?
During the past 4 years.
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
Yeah, voters wanted change, and this wasn't the answer they were looking for.
Not sure that mattered.
From this point forward, Harris's numbers plummeted, and she lost the presidential election, being only the second Democrat to lose the popular vote since 1992. Sometimes a political quote doesn't destroy a campaign, nor does it even show desperation. Sometimes a politician says a quote because they know that they are quite confident, rubbing it into their opponent. This was the case in the early 1990s with Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating. After a leadership spill that saw Bob Hawke out and Paul Keating in, many pundits assumed that the Labour Party was done for. However, the Liberal Party, now under the leadership of John Hewson, introduced a plan called Fight Back, which was a mixture of spending cuts and tax cuts for businesses, but also instituted a goods and services tax of 15%. All Hewson had to do was to see how promising to raise taxes helped Walter Mondale. Anyway, Keating knew that this was an unpopular policy, and instead of talking about his own economic plan, he constantly just let the Liberals continue to defend Fight Back.
So I'm curious, because I don't know Australian politics, the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, is the Labour Party also a left side party in Australia? Because I know in the UK, Labour is the Liberal Party. But Australia also has a Liberal Party, so I don't know. I mean, so our Australian viewers, please let me know. What's the political party system like there?
Which started chipping away at support for the Liberals. During a sitting of the Australian House of Representatives, Hewson attacked Keating for not wanting to talk about the Liberals' fight-back policy. After Hewson's question,
if you are so confident about your view of fight back, why won't you call an early election? Because
I really wish we had this system, the parliamentary system like this in the United States. It would be so much fun to watch the president have to get up and, debate policy with the other side.
Order. The answer is, mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
Essentially, Keating knew that no matter what he said, the unpopularity of Fightback would lead Labor to victory. In the docuseries Labor and Power, which I highly, highly recommend if you want to know more about Australian politics, Labor Senator Reg Withers said that Fightback was what killed the Liberals in the 1993 election. Labor scored the upset victory, with Keating living to fight another day as Prime Minister. Sometimes releasing a 650-page economic policy like Fightback might not be the best decision.
Oh, no.
Especially
Rick Perry, who was Secretary of Energy,
when the results will be met with criticism. But that's still better than not knowing your own policy at all. In 2011, Texas Governor Rick Perry announced that he was seeking the Republican nomination for president. Early on, Rick Perry was battling with eventual nominee Mitt Romney, being within the margin of error of Romney in many of the polls.
Now, I think this is a great example of a quote that really may have hurt somebody in their chance for a victory. Rick Perry, governor of Texas, right? After George W. Bush was governor of Texas, and, kind of in that same vein of politics and similar style, similar, way of speaking. And he has this pretty close primary fight with Mitt Romney, who is viewed as a more liberal member of the Republican Party compared to a Southern Republican, conservative Republican like Perry.
One of Perry's campaign focuses was to slash the federal government, going as far as to even removing departments from the federal government. During a debate on November 9th, 2011, Perry was asked about those departments.
Commerce, education, and the what's the third one there? Let's see.
EPA?
EPA, there you go. No, okay.
Let's talk deposition.
Seriously? Is EPA the one you were talking about?
No, it's energy.
You can't name the third one?
The third agency of government,
Yeah.
I would do away with the education,
This was brutal. I mean, this does not reflect well when you are in a tight race and you can't remember it. That one was bad.
Commerce, and let's see. I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry.
Yeah, that didn't help. His campaign went south from that point on, with Perry eventually dropping out just before the South Carolina primary. Of course, not knowing what you want to do as president
Howard
while
Dean.
running for president with all of the nation's cameras pointing at you isn't great. But sometimes people just scream on stage. Yes, you know where I'm going with this, and...
Yeah, honestly, in hindsight, this should not have been nearly as big a deal as it was. It was just kind of embarrassing more than anything. It didn't reflect in any way, shape, or form on Howard Dean as a person or anything like that. I don't know that he was going to win anything anyway. But he did end up, I think, becoming the DNC chairman.
Yes, I've already made a video about Howard Dean's political career, so check that out. Going into the 2004 Democratic primary season, Howard Dean was the frontrunner in most of the polls.
Yeah.
But in the weeks before the Iowa caucuses, Dean dropped from being a strong first to falling to third, with both John Kerry, who we will be talking about soon, and John Edwards moving ahead of Dean.
And Kerry ends up the nominee. Edwards is his running mate.
And honestly, Dean didn't really do anything to actually lose support.
Yeah.
It was just that voters had a change of heart. Still, after Dean finished third in the Iowa caucuses, he was advised by his campaign manager, Ted Kennedy campaign flunky Joe Trippi, as well as Senator Tom Harkin to go out there and give them hell. Now, personally, I think the actual scream gets more attention than it deserves.
I agree with him on that. It's just one of those things that people like to watch and laugh at, kind of like the Jeb Bush please clap thing, that I don't think really made that much of a difference. But it's still interesting to talk about.
Because it was just more than the scream. Honestly, the whole thing looked absolutely unhinged. So here's the clip.
Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. And we're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House.
Yeah, that didn't look good. The only primary that Dean would win was the Vermont primary, and that was months after he had already dropped out of the race. But it is true that being emotional can lead to your emotions getting the best of you and saying something that you might regret being caught on camera. That can be said for our next politician, George Allen. Allen was in a tough re-election bid against former Secretary of the Navy, Jim Webb. One of the things that Webb's campaign did was to have campaign staffers follow Allen's campaign and record every one of his public appearances. One of those who followed Allen was S.R. Siddharth, an American citizen who was born in the United States, but of Indian descent. He had attended a number of Allen's events and eventually became a familiar face to Senator Allen. On August 11, 2006, at Breaks Interstate Park in rural southwest Virginia, Allen finally snapped.
This fella over here with the yellow shirt, Macaca, or whatever his name is, he's with my opponent. He's following us around everywhere. And it's just great. We're going to places all over Virginia. And he's having it on film, and it's great to have you here, and you show it to your opponent because he's never been there and probably will never come. So it's good for you. Rather than living inside the Beltway, or his opponent actually right now is with a bunch of Hollywood movie moguls. We care about fact, not fiction. So welcome. Let's give a welcome to Macaca here. Welcome to America and the real world of Virginia.
Not only did Allen use a racial slur, with macaca being closely the same as monkey in French, but also implied that Siddharth wasn't American, which he absolutely was. At the time, Allen was leading in every poll, sometimes outside the margin of error. But after this incident, which was plastered all over television and the internet, the race got closer. Webb would go on to win the election by less than 0.5%.
I'll say I don't think it was intentionally racist, but very often in politics, what your intentions are and how it gets spun or how it comes across are often two very different things.
Another person who might have said something that he wished he could take back was Gary Hart, former senator of Colorado who is making his second run for the presidency in 1988. Hart, along with New York Governor Mario Cuomo, were considered the frontrunners for the Democratic nomination. But once Cuomo decided that he wasn't going to run for the nomination, Hart was the clear frontrunner.
Yeah, I mean, Gary Hart was figured by everybody to be the nominee to run against George H.W. Bush in 1988.
But even with this being the case, it was known in Washington circles that Hart was probably a less than faithful husband and had numerous affairs. In an interview...
And this is not unusual for a political candidate, right? I mean, Bill Clinton, who would be the nominee 4 years later, very famously also did. It just, he hit it a little better.
That Gary Hart conducted with E.J. Dionne, which was published on May 2nd, 1987, Dionne asked Hart if he was having an affair. Hart denied it, saying, quote, "Follow me around, I don't care. I'm serious. If anybody wants to put a tail on me, go ahead. I'd be very bored." End of quote. Well, someone did put a tail on him and investigated his past. On the same day that the New York Times published their article, the Miami Herald published an expose on Hart, which said, quote, Gary Hart, the Democratic presidential candidate who has dismissed allegations of womanizing, spent Friday night and most of Saturday in his Capitol Hill townhouse with a young woman who flew from Miami to meet him. Hart denied any impropriety, end of quote. A few days later, the Herald reported that Donna Rice was the woman who met with Hart, and she denied that there was anything going on between the two.
And there's so much of these exact same kinds of stories that happened 4 years later with Bill Clinton.
Media dug deeper and found that the relationship between Hart and Rice had been going on for a while and had met a number of times on a yacht called Monkey Business, which Rice had confirmed.
And I think the difference is that when it happened with Clinton, it was pretty clear that it was in the past, whereas this was a current thing that was still happening.
With the mounting pressure against him, he dropped out of the race on May 8th. If there is anything that people remember about the whole Gary Hart incident, it was the picture of Rice sitting on Hart's lap. However, this photo wasn't released until June 2nd, 1987 in the National Enquirer, nearly a month after Hart had already dropped out. So, no, Hart didn't win the Democratic nomination. The person who would go on to win the Democratic nomination in 1988 was Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. And yes, I've already made a video about that campaign. Anyway, Dukakis was now the Democratic nominee and had to take on the Republican nominee, Vice President George Bush. By the time of the October 13th, 1988 presidential debate at UCLA, the Dukakis campaign was already in freefall. Attacks on his record were fast and furious, and his record of being against the death penalty were constantly being brought up by the Bush campaign.
That said, I've often said about this that I thought this was a little bit out of line, that they even asked this question.
The death penalty became the wedge issue that made it look like Dukakis didn't share the values of most Americans. But it wasn't the Bush administration that dealt the fatal blow, but instead CNN anchor Bernard Shaw, who was the moderator of the debate. Shaw opened up with the following.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
See, to me, that is a completely out-of-line question to ask in a presidential debate, and some of you might argue, well, no, it's perfectly reasonable to ask him what he would do in that scenario, but, to throw, like, such an emotionally charged question right at the beginning of the debate like that, that never sat well with me, and honestly, while I think this contributed to his downfall, I think the whole Willie Horton thing, this parole of a killer out of prison on the weekend, and some other things like him doing the video of him riding in the tank, all contributed. It was just a very poor campaign.
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life.
Yes, the campaign was sinking, but now it was sunk. George Bush would dominate the general election with that debate performance, killing Dukakis' chance of winning. Another poor debate performance was that of Canadian Prime Minister John Turner in 1984. When Pierre Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister of Canada in 1984...
And that's the father of Justin Trudeau.
The leader of the Liberal Party, he was replaced by John Turner, who defeated future Prime Minister Jean Chrétien for the Liberal Party leadership. Immediately, an election was called, which saw Turner pitted against new Progressive Conservative leader Brian Mulroney. But before leaving 24 Sussex, Trudeau made a deal with the Liberals. Trudeau, who was becoming less popular with each passing day, said that he would only resign early if the incoming Prime Minister, whether that was Turner or Chrétien, appointed a number of people to patronage positions. Trudeau himself had already appointed 200 people to these positions, but Turner, now the new Prime Minister, appointed an additional 18 people that Trudeau wanted in. This basically smelled of corruption, though this was and still is a practice that happens in Canadian politics. This became one of the most contentious issues of the 1984 campaign. When asked about the patronage positions, Turner tried to answer it as diplomatically as possible. Here's the exchange.
Well, I've told you and told the Canadian people, Mr. Mulroney, that I had no option.
Well,
Truman, your next question,
you
please.
had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it. This is wrong for Canada, and I am not going to ask Canadians to pay the price. You had an option, sir, to say no, and you chose to say yes to the old attitudes.
He opened the door to that one. I mean, he invited that. He really
and
did.
The old stories of the Liberal Party. That, sir, if I may say respectfully, that is not good enough.
That's such a good Canadian way. If I could say, if I could say so respectfully, yeah, that was so good.
For Canadians.
I had no option if I was able to.
That is an avowal of failure. That is a confession of non-leadership, and this country needs
leadership. That's a
leadership.
great point.
You had an option.
I don't know anything about this scenario, but he's making an excellent point.
Sir, you could have done better.
Mr. Turner, your response, please.
I just said, Mr. Moderator, taken the Canadian people through the circumstances. Mr. Trudeau had every right to make those appointments before he resigned. In order that he not do so, yes, I had to make a commitment to him. Otherwise, I was advised that with serious consequences to the Canadian people, I could not have been granted the opportunity of forming a government.
This sank the Liberal Party's chances, and Mulroney swept into office with a commanding majority. Another Liberal Party leader who was absolutely destroyed in a federal election debate was Michael Ignatieff. After the Liberal Party under Paul Martin lost to Stephen Harper's newly merged Conservative Party, which merged the old Progressive Conservatives and Preston Manning's Reform Party, the
Progressive Conservatives. Interesting concept.
Liberals went with Stéphane Dion, a political science professor from Quebec. But the Liberals would lose more seats in 2008 and replace Dion with Ignatieff, who was also a political science professor and spent much of his life overseas. Once Ignatieff became Liberal Party leader, he acted more like he was a prime minister in waiting instead of simply being the leader of the opposition. Granted,
that's kind of what the leader of the opposition is, though, right? I mean, I guess it's all in how you interpret what that means.
Ignatieff became the leader of the opposition. The Liberals did improve in the polls, but that didn't last long, as Stephen Harper looked as if he was headed for a majority. And while Harper showed up for Prime Minister's questions, Ignatieff had a less than impressive attendance record. This was something that NDP leader Jack Layton wanted to make known.
Okay, so now I get it. He was not confronting the Prime Minister directly. He was kind of operating more in the shadows.
Layton's NDP were already starting to make inroads in Quebec, where they had only won 2 seats previously, one of which I talk about in this video here. And when the debate came, Layton delivered one of the best blows in Canadian political history.
I have to pick up on something Mr. Ignatieff said. He said before you have to walk the walk and you have to be a strong leader and respect Parliament. I've got to ask you then, why do you have the worst attendance record in the House of Commons of any member of Parliament? If you want to be Prime Minister, you better learn how to be a member of Parliament first. You know, most Canadians, if they don't show up for work, they don't get a promotion.
Great question. Great question.
I don't surrender to anybody in my respect for the institution of Parliament and my obligation to the people who put me there. So don't give me lessons about respect for democracy.
Well,
don't give me lessons. Don't give me lessons
I was
for
there
respect
standing up to
about
Mr. Harper and voting.
Yeah, he made an excellent point, and the response was, "You can't talk to me like that." That's not much of a response.
Against his policies, and you weren't in the chamber. You missed 70% of the votes. I think you need to understand a little bit more about how our democracy...
Listen, I don't even know who's who here as far as the parties go, so I've got no dog in this fight. I'm not Canadian. I don't know the parties. But I just, on the surface, looking at this, he landed a knockout on this one.
That's my only point.
Within days of that debate, the NDP went from being a distant third to being tied with the Liberals.
Wow.
A few weeks later, the NDP would finish second, forming the official opposition. In the province of Quebec, the Liberals were almost wiped out, with one MP, Justin Trudeau, holding on to his Papineau right. And yes, I will eventually be doing a video about the NDP and Jack Layton. And with that, let's move back stateside to the 1976 presidential election. This
is another example of one that I think is a perfectly fair thing to criticize him for, what he says here. And I know where they're going with this. There's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. But I'm not sure it mattered to the outcome of the election. I don't see a scenario in which Ford was going to win that election in the aftermath of everything that happened with Nixon.
shaping up to be one of the closest presidential elections in history. The Democrats had nominated Jimmy Carter, the former governor of Georgia and peanut farmer who was basically an unknown. I talk about that nomination campaign in this video. As for Gerald Ford, he had been catapulted to the presidency due to the resignations of Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon, and defeated Ronald Reagan in the Republican primaries, which I talk about in this video.
So for those who aren't familiar with the whole story, Gerald Ford from Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, he is the House Minority Leader. So we talked earlier about how the Republicans had never been in control of Congress for decades. And so he's the leader of the Republicans in Congress. And when the Vice President, Spiro Agnew, resigns over corruption issues under the new amendment to the Constitution that allowed for this, President Nixon was able to make an appointment for vice president, and he appoints Gerald Ford to be vice president, and that had to be then confirmed, but he was confirmed as vice president. And then Nixon resigns, and so Ford becomes president without having been elected vice president or president. Only time in history that's happened.
Anyway, this election could...
But then afterwards, he pardoned Nixon and basically said our long national nightmare is over, and now we don't have to worry about that. And a lot of people held on to that and held that against him, and I'm not sure he was ever going to overcome that.
Have gone either way, and the debates became one of the determining factors to win undecided voters. The first debate was uneventful, with the exception of the debate being stopped for 27 minutes because of audio trouble. But the second debate was about foreign policy, particularly regarding the Cold War. This is where Ford could have stood out, as his foreign policy resume was much more impressive than that of Carter's.
Right. He is the sitting president. You've got this kind of relatively unknown governor from southwest Georgia, who is kind of seen as like this country bumpkin by a lot of people. And you could really distance yourself from him by showing your strong command of foreign policy in the middle of the Cold War at a very crucial time right after Vietnam.
In a question about the Helsinki Accords, an agreement that sought to ease tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, one of the debate moderators, Max Frankel, asked Gerald Ford this.
Mr. President, I'd like to explore a little more deeply our relationship with the Russians. They used to brag back in Khrushchev's day that because of their greater patience and because of our greed for business deals, that they would sooner or later get the better of us. Is it possible that despite some setbacks in the Middle East, they've proved their point? Our allies in France and Italy are now flirting with communism. We've recognized a permanent communist regime in East Germany. We've virtually signed in Helsinki an agreement that the Russians have dominance in Eastern Europe. We've bailed out Soviet agriculture with our huge grain sales. We've given them large loans, access to our best technology, and if the Senate hadn't interfered with the Jackson Amendment, maybe you would have given them even larger loans. Is that what you call a two-way street of traffic in Europe?
It has been accomplished by the Helsinki Agreement. Number one, we have an agreement where they notify us and we notify them of any military maneuvers that are to be undertaken. They have done it in both cases where they've done so. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
No reasonable human being thinks that the Soviets were not dominating Eastern Europe. That was so brutal, so out of touch, and so tone deaf of a thing for the sitting president of the United States to say in a presidential debate.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say?
Yeah, I mean, even the moderator's like, I'm sorry, what? Like he couldn't believe he had actually heard him say that.
Sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone, whereas on our side of the line, the Italians and the French are still flirting with possibility.
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union.
Brutal.
As a matter of fact, I visited Poland, Yugoslavia, and Romania to make certain that the people of those countries understood that the President of the United States and the people of the United States are dedicated to their independence, their autonomy, and their freedom.
And it does not matter how you qualified it, how you explained it, how you justified it. All anybody had to do was go back and replay that sentence. There is no Soviet domination in Eastern Europe. That's all anybody heard.
This alone was probably enough to tip the election
And
over.
look at Carter. He knows that he just scored big without having to do a thing.
Carter, as it indeed ended up being one of the closest elections in recent history. Another election that was expected to be close was the 2004 presidential election. The Democrats nominated John Kerry, who had an impressive resume, but didn't exactly have the star quality of somebody like Bill Clinton. In fact, Kerry had his Michael Dukakis in the tank moment when he won out windsurfing. Essentially, Kerry's campaign was being compared to Dukakis' campaign, with one PR blunder after another. However, one of the quotes that sank him really wasn't his fault, but taken out of context. In 2003, Kerry supported an $87 billion fund.
The flip-flop thing. The quote went to a larger issue, which was that this was kind of the main opposition talking point to him, was that he was a flip-flopper, that you couldn't trust him, that he would go back on issues and do whatever was political expediency.
To continue military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, with part of the condition being that the Bush tax cuts for wealthier Americans would be eliminated. Kerry voted for that version of the bill. But when the final bill didn't remove the tax cuts for the wealthy, Kerry voted against it. When asked in a town hall
which, when you explain it that way, is a perfectly reasonable political position to take. But again, sound bites are everything, and it doesn't matter what the explanation behind it is. It only matters what people can cut out from your quote and use.
Reading about this, Kerry explained that he first voted for the bill, but then not the final version. This led Kerry saying that he had voted for the bill before he had voted against it. This led to Kerry saying, quote, "I voted for the bill before I voted against it," end quote. The Bush campaign would take this out of context, only use the "I voted for it before I voted against it" quote, and made it look like Kerry was a flip-flopper. Kerry would go on to lose the election by a larger margin than expected. I tried to find a longer clip, but I can only find one very low-quality clip of this incident on the internet. Sorry about that. Another person who would lose by a large margin 6 years later was U.S. Senate candidate Christine O'Donnell in Delaware. This was a special election to replace outgoing Senator Joe Biden, who is now vice president. Initially, the natural successor to Biden was Mike Castle, who served as governor of Delaware as well as the state's sole member of Congress. In fact, the Democrats really didn't even put up a fight, putting up president of the new Castle County Council, Chris Coons, as their candidate.
Which is interesting, because when we think of Delaware, I think of that as being a relatively reliable Democrat state. So to think that the natural successor to Biden was going to be a Republican.
However, 2010 was the Tea Party year, with the Republican candidate who ran against Joe Biden 2 years earlier, Christine O'Donnell, making another run for the seat. In an upset, O'Donnell defeated Castle in the Republican primary and took on Coons in the general election. During the general election, old video clips of her on Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher surfaced, in which she said that she dabbled in witchcraft, which led to Democrats making fun of her being a witch. But instead of brushing it off as nonsense, the O'Donnell campaign decided to run a commercial.
I'm not a witch. I'm nothing you've heard. I'm you. None of us are perfect, But none of us can be happy with what we see all around us. Politicians who think spending, trading favors, and backroom deals are the ways to stay in office. I'll go to Washington and do what you do. I'm Christine O'Donnell, and I approve this message. I'm you.
Honestly, I thought it was a good commercial.
Yeah.
However, the only thing that anyone remembered for the commercial was that O'Donnell was saying that she was not a witch.
What is the lesson that we have seen in these last several examples? If it can be taken out of context, it will be taken out of context. So you have to be careful with what you say. And I get that as somebody who says a lot of stuff on the internet, some of which could be taken out of context. But I'm not running for politics, for political office, nor do I ever intend to.
That was it. O'Donnell would go on to lose Chris Coons by over 16% and has been pretty quiet since.
Yeah. All right, we're not going to watch every one of them. There's still a few more. The link is down in the description. If you want to watch the video in its entirety, you can check out all of it and see the ones that we didn't cover in there. And if you think there's one that we should have covered that should have been mentioned that wasn't, let me know in the comment section below. I want to thank, and these are just the usernames, this is all I have, is Woody. I want to thank Woody, and I want to thank Srolex for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much. Check out some of these other videos if you want to learn more. Thanks for watching.